Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into John C. Maxwell's approach to leading through crisis. And we've got this facilitator guide from his mastermind groups as our source material. And let me tell you, some of these insights are real eye-openers. Imagine this.
Yeah.
You're facing a crisis,
What?
pressure's mounting, and suddenly your true character is not created by the crisis, but revealed by it. How does that change the way you think about handling tough situations?
That's a good question. That's really the heart of what we're exploring today. Maxwell's framework really challenges that pressure makes diamonds idea. It's
Yeah.
more like a crisis turns up the heat, and your pre-existing strengths and weaknesses become impossible to ignore.
Okay. So before we jump into strategies, how does Maxwell actually define a crisis?
Yeah, good question. He calls it, well, let me see. He calls it an intense time of difficulty requiring a decision that will be a turning point. And what's interesting is he emphasizes that this doesn't just apply to like massive company-wide shakeups. This could be a personal health crisis,
Mhm.
a sudden job loss,
Yeah.
or even a major relationship shift. These are all moments that force us to make, tough choices that change our trajectory.
Yeah, that makes me think about the time I had to unexpectedly pivot careers. It felt like my whole world was turned upside down. And the decisions I made during those initial weeks had a huge impact on where I ended up. It definitely felt like a personal crisis, even though it wasn't, making national headlines or anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the way we react in these moments, whether on a personal level or organizational level, often reveals a lot about our leadership style. For example, imagine two CEOs facing a product recall. One immediately focuses on protecting their team, even if it means taking a financial hit. The other prioritizes saving face and deflecting blame, even if it erodes team trust. Both are facing the same crisis, but their actions reveal very different underlying values.
Yeah, that's a great example of how actions speak louder than words. But knowing a crisis is coming is one thing. How do we handle the mental chaos when it actually is? Maxwell points to 3 key distractions that can really throw us off course.
He calls them mind wandering,
Mm-hmm.
negative thinking, and uncertain anxiety.
Yeah.
Each one pulls us away from what we can actually control and makes effective decision-making nearly impossible. Mind wandering makes us lose focus on the present. Negative thinking distorts our view of the situation. And uncertain anxiety basically paralyzes us with what-if scenarios.
Uncertain anxiety. Oh, I think I'm very familiar with that one. Remember that time when that major project got delayed?
Yeah.
And I completely spiraled.
Right.
What if we lost the client? What if my whole team got laid off because of this? Talk about unproductive.
Oh, it's so easy to fall into that trap. And I bet in that moment, it was hard to even remember, like, the basics,
Mhm.
like taking a deep breath or focusing on what you could control.
It really was. So besides the obvious advice like, deep breathing, what are some practical strategies Maxwell suggests for battling those distractions, especially when the pressure is on?
Well, he advocates for kind of a multi-pronged approach. For mind wandering, it's about grounding techniques, not just meditation, but things like actively engaging your senses. What do you see, hear, feel in this exact moment? This helps pull you back from mental tangents. For negative thinking, it's about actively challenging those thoughts. Don't just accept them as truth. Ask yourself, what's the evidence for this? Or is there another way to interpret the situation?
So instead of thinking, this is a disaster, my career is over, I might ask, okay, this is a setback, but what specific steps can I take to mitigate the damage?
Exactly. And for uncertain anxiety, Maxwell emphasizes creating a plan of action.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have all the answers, focusing on concrete steps you can take, no matter how small, helps counteract that feeling of helplessness.
Okay, so if we go back to the product recall example, instead of panicking about the potential fallout, the CEO could focus on immediate steps, like contacting affected customers, issuing a public statement, and working with their team to identify the root cause of the problem.
Exactly. It's about shifting from worry to problem solving. But here's the thing. Even with the best strategies, sometimes those distractions win, right?
Yeah.
And that's where Maxwell's concept of character being revealed during a crisis comes in. Let's say you're in that uncertain anxiety spiral and you snap at a team member. That might reveal a tendency to buckle under pressure. Or maybe you see a colleague struggling and you instinctively step in to offer support, even though you're stressed yourself. That could reveal a deep-rooted sense of empathy.
Oh, yeah. This makes me think about leaders I've worked with in the past, the ones who remained calm and supportive during tough times. Their teams were always more cohesive and resilient. And those who blamed others or shut down communication, they ended up losing the trust of their teams and ultimately their ability to lead effectively.
And that's why this whole idea of character being revealed is so crucial. It's not about judging ourselves. It's about taking an honest look at how we tend to react under pressure and using that awareness to become better leaders. Because if we know, for example, that we tend to withdraw when things get tough, we can actively work on strategies for staying engaged and communicating openly, even when we feel overwhelmed.
We've talked about defining a crisis and battling those mental distractions. What's next on Maxwell's agenda for leading effectively?
Well, he brings in kind of a fascinating analogy, comparing a leader in crisis to a football coach at halftime.
Okay.
Imagine the score's not in your favor. The opponent's playing hard, and you got to make adjustments. That's what adaptability looks like in real time.
I love that analogy. But some leaders might resist being early for fear of appearing like alarmist. How do you balance preparedness with not creating unnecessary panic?
That's a fantastic question, and one that many leaders grapple with for sure. It's about finding that sweet spot between proactive communication and responsible messaging. For example, instead of sending out a company-wide email about a potential issue that might not even materialize, you could start by pre-drafting communication templates for various crisis scenarios. That way, if the situation does escalate, you're not starting from scratch in a moment of high stress.
I see. So it's about doing the behind-the-scenes prep work
Hmm.
without setting off alarm bells prematurely. But what if you're dealing with a really fast-moving crisis where there's no time for like pre-drafted templates? How does showing up early apply then?
In those instances, showing up early might mean being the first to address the issue with your team before rumors and speculation take hold. It's about controlling the narrative, providing clear and accurate information, and setting the tone for how the crisis will be handled.
So it's about establishing yourself as the trusted source of information and guidance,
Yeah.
even if you don't have all the answers yet.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next element of Maxwell's framework, showing up with clarity. What worked before might not work now. Just like that football coach can't stick to the same playbook if the opponent's figured out their strategy. A leader in crisis needs to be able to assess the situation, make adjustments, and communicate those changes clearly to their team.
This makes me think about companies who have faced like public relations disasters. The ones who try to like downplay the issue or deflect blame
Yeah.
often end up making the situation worse. But those who acknowledge the problem head on, outline a clear plan of action, and communicate transparently throughout the process tend to regain public trust more quickly.
Absolutely. And showing up with clarity also means being decisive. In a crisis, people need to know what's happening, what's expected of them, and what the path forward looks like. Uncertainty breeds anxiety. So a leader who can cut through the chaos and provide clear direction will inspire confidence and calm within their team.
Be the calm amidst the storm. Don't just react. Lead.
That's the idea. But there's one more element to showing up that Maxwell emphasizes, and it's arguably the most important: showing up with hope.
Okay, I think this is where some leaders might stumble. How do you project hope without downplaying the seriousness of the situation or appearing naive?
That's a crucial distinction. Showing up with hope doesn't mean sugarcoating the situation or pretending everything is fine. It's about acknowledging the challenges honestly, but also conveying a belief that you'll get through this together, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
So it's not, don't worry, everything will be fine, but more like, this is tough, but we've got a plan, we're working together, and we'll come out of this stronger on the other side.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the reality of the situation, while also inspiring a sense of optimism and shared purpose. Remember, hope is a powerful motivator. It gives people something to hold on to when things feel bleak.
That brings us to the real crux of the issue. What does effective action look like when you're leading through a crisis? What specific steps should a leader be taking?
Well, Maxwell is a big believer in delegating effectively. You can't do it all yourself, especially in a crisis. You need to identify the strengths of your team members and empower them to take ownership of specific tasks.
Well, wouldn't delegating during a crisis risk things falling apart even further?
It certainly can, if it's not done well. But remember, effective delegation isn't just throwing tasks at people randomly. It involves carefully considering who's best suited for what, providing clear instructions and expectations, and creating systems for accountability. And importantly, it requires trust. You have to trust that your team can handle the responsibility.
So it's not about abdicating responsibility, but rather about empowering your team to utilize their unique skills and expertise to tackle the crisis collectively.
Exactly. And that trust goes both ways. When you delegate effectively, you're showing your team that you believe in their abilities, which can boost morale and strengthen the sense of shared responsibility.
Okay, I'm seeing how this all ties together now. You've got to address those mental distractions, show up as a leader with clarity and hope, and delegate strategically. But are there other key elements to Maxwell's crisis leadership plan that we should be aware of?
Absolutely. There are a few more crucial pieces to this puzzle, and I think they'll be even more impactful if we explore them after a quick break.
Great, let's take a few minutes to gather our thoughts, and we'll be right back to continue our deep dive into leading through crisis with John C. Maxwell.
Welcome back. We were just talking about delegation in a crisis right before the break.
Yeah.
It's a little counterintuitive, isn't it? You would think a leader needs to take charge and control everything. But Maxwell actually argues that empowering your team through delegation is crucial for effective crisis management.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive at first, but I'm starting to see how giving your team more ownership could actually make things run smoother, especially when you're dealing with multiple moving parts.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just like task management, you know. Delegating effectively also demonstrates trust in your team's capabilities, which can be incredibly motivating during, stressful times.
So it's not just about getting things done. It's about building morale and fostering a sense of collective responsibility.
Exactly. Now, Maxwell doesn't just stop at delegation. He brings up another crucial element, ensuring that your actions are aligned with your values. This is where things get really interesting, especially when you consider his point about crisis-revealing character.
I'm curious about this. How can a leader ensure their actions are truly aligned with their values when they're in the heat of the moment, dealing with a high-pressure situation?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's easy to talk about values when everything's calm and predictable. But a crisis really puts those values to the test. Imagine you're a company leader facing a financial downturn. Laying off employees is obviously a tough decision, but one that might be necessary for the survival of the business. How do you navigate that situation while staying true to your values of, say, caring for your employees and fostering a supportive work environment?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It almost seems like there's a conflict between doing what's best for the business and staying true to those values.
Exactly, and that's where deliberate thinking becomes so important. Remember, Maxwell argues that a crisis isn't the time for knee-jerk reactions. It's about taking a step back, pausing, and engaging in thoughtful strategic thinking.
But isn't that easier said than done? When you're in crisis mode, it feels like every decision needs to be made yesterday. How do you actually carve out the space for deliberate thinking when the pressure's on?
It is a challenge, no doubt. One strategy Maxwell suggests is building a thinking team, a group of trusted advisors who can provide diverse perspectives and challenge your assumptions.
So kind of like a personal board of directors for crisis management.
Exactly. These are people you can turn to for honest feedback, sound advice, and just a fresh perspective when you're feeling overwhelmed. Ideally, this team includes people both inside and outside your organization, individuals who can offer different viewpoints and help you avoid blind spots.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes the pressure off having to come up with all the answers yourself. And it introduces a level of accountability, knowing that your decisions will be vetted by a group of trusted advisors.
Precisely. It helps you avoid tunnel vision,
Yeah.
which is so easy to fall into during a crisis. And speaking of communication, that's another crucial element of Maxwell's framework.
Communication. But we already talked about that in the context of showing up. How is communication as a standalone element different?
You're right. We did touch on communication earlier. But here, Maxwell dives into the specifics of how to communicate effectively throughout the entire crisis, not just in those initial moments. It's about providing regular updates, being transparent about the challenges, and clearly outlining the steps being taken to address the situation.
So it's not a one-and-done situation. It's about ongoing strategic communication that keeps everyone informed and aligned.
Exactly. And it's not just the content of the communication that matters, but the tone as well. Your team is looking to you for reassurance and direction. Your communication should be calm, confident, and empathetic.
Okay, so no panicking or finger pointing.
Right. You want to project a sense of stability and control, even if you're feeling anything but. And this is where that element of hope we discussed earlier comes in.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of a crisis, you need to remind people of the bigger picture, the shared goals you're working towards, and the beliefs that you'll get through this together.
It's like that saying, hope is not a strategy, but it's a vital ingredient for any strategy to work.
Well said. Now, beyond communication, Maxwell emphasizes having a clear decision-making process in place. Because when you're in the middle of a crisis, it's easy to let emotions cloud your judgment.
Yeah. And that can lead to impulsive decisions that you later regret.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to have a framework for making decisions that's based on logic, data, and your core values.
Hmm.
Even under pressure, you're not just shooting from the hip. You've got a system to guide you.
So what does that decision-making system actually look like in practice?
Well, Maxwell advocates for a structured approach
Mm.
that involves gathering all the relevant information, considering different perspectives,
Mm.
weighing the potential consequences, and then making a decision that's aligned with your values and the best interests of your team.
It sounds simple enough when you lay it out like that, but I imagine it's a lot harder to put into practice when the stakes are high and you're feeling the pressure to act quickly.
It is. But having that structured decision-making process can help you avoid making those rash decisions that you later regret. It's like having a map when you're lost in the woods. It might not be easy to follow, but it's better than wandering around aimlessly.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered communication, decision-making.
Right.
Are there any other essential pieces to Maxwell's crisis leadership puzzle?
There's one more I want to touch on before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The role of the team. We've talked a lot about the leader's role in a crisis, but what about the team? What can they do to support the leader and contribute to a successful outcome?
That's a great question. It can't all fall on the leader's shoulders, right?
Exactly. And Maxwell emphasizes that teamwork is absolutely essential for navigating a crisis successfully. One of the most important things team members can do is to stay informed and communicate openly with their leader.
Okay, so no keeping secrets or hoarding information.
Right. Everyone needs to be on the same page. And that requires open and honest communication, both up and down the chain of command.
And what about those distractions we talked about earlier? How can team members help each other avoid falling into those traps?
Well, one thing they can do is to create a culture of support and accountability. Encourage each other to stay focused, challenge that negative thinking, and offer practical help when needed. It's about recognizing that everyone is under stress and working together to stay grounded and productive.
So kind of like a buddy system for crisis management.
Exactly. Because let's face it, crisis can be isolating and overwhelming.
Mm.
Even for the most seasoned leaders, having a supportive team around you can make all the difference.
It's like that old African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
I love that. And it perfectly captures the spirit of teamwork that's so essential for navigating a crisis successfully. Now, in addition to communication and mutual support, Maxwell highlights another key contribution team members can make, taking ownership of their roles and responsibilities.
So it's not just about following orders, it's about being proactive and taking initiative.
Exactly. Everyone needs to step up and contribute to the best of their ability. And that might mean going above and beyond the call of duty, taking on new tasks, or working longer hours.
But it's also important to remember that everyone has their limits, right? Burnout is a real risk during a crisis, and pushing people too hard can backfire.
Absolutely. And that's where open communication comes in again. Team members need to feel comfortable speaking up if they're feeling overwhelmed, asking for help, or delegating tasks to others.
So it's about finding that balance between stepping up and taking ownership, but also knowing when to ask for support and set boundaries.
Precisely. And that balance is easier to find when there's a strong foundation of trust and mutual respect within the team.
This makes me think about the importance of company culture, even outside of a crisis situation. If a company fosters a culture of collaboration, open communication, and mutual support, it seems like they'd be much better equipped to handle a crisis when it inevitably arises.
I couldn't agree more. A healthy company culture is like a shock absorber. It can help cushion the blow of a crisis and make the experience less traumatic for everyone involved.
Now, we've been talking a lot about crisis leadership in the context of organizations, but I'm curious about how these principles apply to, like, our personal lives.
That's a fantastic point. We all face crises on a personal level,
Right.
whether it's a health scare, a financial setback, or a relationship breakdown. And those experiences can be just as challenging and disorienting as any organizational crisis.
They really can. And it seems like a lot of the same principles would apply. Stay informed, communicate openly, make decisions thoughtfully, lean on your support network, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
Absolutely. And remember that element of hope we discussed?
Yeah.
That's crucial on a personal level as well, even when things feel bleak.
Mm.
Hold on to the belief that you'll get through this and emerge stronger on the other side.
Yeah. Because ultimately, it's our mindset that determines how we experience and respond to a crisis. If we approach it with fear and negativity, we're likely to make things worse.
But if we approach it with courage, resilience, and a belief in our ability to overcome challenges,
Mm,
we're much more likely to find our way through the storm and come out stronger on the other side.
well said. And that brings us back to Maxwell's core message. Crisis reveals character. It's a test of our values, our resilience, and our leadership abilities.
And it's an opportunity to learn,
Yeah.
grow, and become the best versions of ourselves.
Now, I know we need to wrap up this section soon, but there's one more aspect of leading through crisis that I think is worth exploring: the importance of after-action review.
Ah, yes, the learning phase.
Because once the dust settles and the crisis has passed, it's essential to take the time to reflect on what happened, what worked well, what could have been done better, and what lessons can be learned for the future.
It's like debriefing after a mission, you know. You want to identify any areas where you can improve your processes, your communication,
Mm.
or your decision-making for next time.
Because let's be honest, there's always a next time. Crises are an inevitable part of life, both personally and professionally. Sadly, that's true. So the more we can learn from each experience, the better equipped we'll be to handle whatever challenges come our way in the future.
And that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To become more resilient, more adaptable, and more effective leaders in the face of adversity.
It is. So after a crisis, gather your team, review the events, celebrate the successes, identify areas for improvement, and document those lessons learned.
That way, you're turning a crisis into an opportunity for growth and development. And who knows, maybe the next crisis won't feel quite so overwhelming.
That's the hope, anyway.
Hmm.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into leading through crisis, I want to circle back to one of the key concepts we discussed earlier: adaptability.
Oh, yeah, the football coach at halftime analogy. I love that one.
It is a powerful image, isn't it? Because it highlights the importance of being flexible, open to change, and willing to adjust our approach as the situation evolves.
Yeah, and that's not always easy,
Yeah.
especially for those of us who like to have a plan and stick to it. I hear you. I'm a planner myself. But in a crisis, clinging rigidly to the plan can be a recipe for disaster because the situation is constantly changing. New information is emerging. And what worked yesterday might not work today.
Exactly. So we need to be willing to let go of our attachment to the plan and embrace the uncertainty, which means being comfortable making decisions with incomplete information, experimenting with different approaches, and course correcting as we go.
And that takes courage because it means admitting that we don't have all the answers, that we're learning as we go.
But that's also what makes leading through crisis so challenging and rewarding.
It is, because it forces us to grow, to stretch beyond our comfort zones, and to tap into our reserves of creativity and resilience. And when we do that, we discover strength we never knew we had.
And we emerge from the experience as more capable and confident leaders.
So embrace the uncertainty. Be willing to adapt, and trust in your ability to find your way through the storm. Those are words to live by, not just in times of crisis, but in all aspects of life.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into leading through crisis. Stay tuned for our final thoughts and a challenge to apply these principles to your own life coming up next. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We've been going deep on John Maxwell's approach to leading through crisis, and I gotta say, it's really got me thinking differently about how to handle those high-pressure moments.
Yeah, it's something that resonates with everybody, right? Because crises, they're a universal experience, unfortunately. Whether it's a global pandemic, a personal financial struggle,
Yeah.
we all face times when everything feels uncertain and the stakes are high.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that keeps coming up for me is Maxwell's emphasis on values. He really drives home the point that a crisis, it's going to expose your true character, for better or worse.
Hmm. He does. And it's not about being like a perfectly moral leader all the time. It's about recognizing that a crisis acts as a magnifying glass, right? If you've been walking the talk, living by your values, your team, they're going to see that consistency, even under pressure. It strengthens trust.
But if there's a disconnect between what you say you believe and how you actually behave when things get tough,
Yeah.
that's when the cracks start to show, right?
Exactly. Exactly. It's like that saying, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Crises are those rough waters that really reveal what you're made of as a leader. And the good news is, even if we don't, love what we see at first, that self-awareness gives us a starting point for growth.
I like that, a starting point. It's not about beating ourselves up for past mistakes, but using that insight to make more intentional choices moving forward.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key element. Maxwell talks about proactive preparation. He's a big advocate for having a crisis leadership plan in place, a framework to guide your decisions and actions when the unexpected inevitably hits.
Having a plan seems so crucial. It's way too easy to get swept up in the emotions of a crisis, make impulsive decisions that you end up regretting later. But I think some folks might be listening and thinking, how can I possibly plan for the unknown?
Yeah, it's a valid question for sure. It's not about predicting the future, right? It's about building a mental model for how you'll approach any high-stakes situation.
Hmm.
Think of it like a fire drill for your leadership skills. You may not know exactly when or where the fire is going to break out, but you've practiced the steps, you know where the exits are, and you have a system for getting everybody to safety.
I love that analogy. It makes it so much clearer. So, how does Maxwell actually break down this crisis leadership plan? What are the key things we should be thinking about?
Well, he emphasizes four main components: communication, delegation, deliberate thinking, and making value-aligned decisions. We've touched on some of these already, but let's unpack them a little more, give our listeners some solid takeaways. First up, communication.
Okay, communication. Maxwell really stresses the importance of clear, consistent, compassionate communication throughout a crisis. Why is that so critical? I mean, we talk about communication all the time on this show, but what makes it different in a crisis situation?
Because in a crisis, people are hungry for information. Think about it. When things feel uncertain, we naturally want to know what's happening, how it's going to affect us, and what the plan is moving forward, right? So clear, honest communication helps reduce anxiety and allows people to take the right action.
And it's not just about broadcasting information from the top down. Maxwell also emphasizes two-way communication, right?
He does. A crisis isn't the time for leaders to isolate themselves and make decisions in a vacuum. It's about engaging with your team, seeking their input, being willing to listen to their concerns and address them head on. That back and forth dialogue builds trust and creates a sense of shared responsibility.
Right, makes sense. So communication's key. We've also talked about delegation being super important during a crisis. Again, why is that so crucial when things are already so chaotic?
Well, delegation during a crisis does a few things. First, it frees up the leader to focus on the big picture strategy, the decisions that only they can make. Second, it empowers team members to use their unique skills and expertise to tackle specific parts of the crisis. And third, it just strengthens the team overall by fostering that sense of shared responsibility.
And Maxwell makes the point that delegating effectively, it's not a sign of weakness, right?
No.
It actually shows that you trust your team, that you're willing to empower them, and that you understand the power of collective intelligence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to do it well, it's not about just randomly assigning tasks. Effective delegation means clearly defining those roles and responsibilities, making sure team members have the resources they need, and establishing clear lines of communication and accountability.
Got it. Communicate clearly, delegate effectively. What else is on Maxwell's crisis leadership plan checklist?
Deliberate thinking. He really emphasizes that a crisis is not the time for impulsive decisions driven by fear or incomplete information. It's about taking a step back, pausing, and engaging in that thoughtful, strategic thinking that we talked about before.
And that's where having that thinking team can be so valuable, right? Surrounding yourself with folks who can offer different perspectives, challenge your assumptions, and help you see the bigger picture.
Exactly, because in a crisis, it's easy to get tunnel vision, to fixate on the immediate threat. A thinking team can help you stay grounded and see the wider consequences of your choices.
And finally, there's that element of making value-aligned decisions. And I think this is where it gets really personal for leaders.
It is. Maxwell argues that a crisis will test your values like nothing else, and the decisions you make in those high-pressure moments really reveal your true character. It's easy to compromise what you believe in when you're under pressure, but ultimately staying true to your values, even when it's tough, is essential for maintaining your integrity, building trust, and leading effectively through a crisis.
So, to sum it up, Maxwell's crisis leadership plan really comes down to communicate clearly, delegate effectively, think deliberately, and make decisions that are aligned with your values.
That's it in a nutshell. And it's a framework that anyone can use, regardless of what industry they're in, their level of experience, or the specifics of the crisis.
And it's a framework that can help us not just survive a crisis, but come out of it stronger and better leaders on the other side.
And as people, because let's face it, facing a crisis is hard, but it also forces us to grow, refine our skills, and discover a resilience we maybe didn't know we had.
It's a test, but it's also an opportunity, for sure.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring John Maxwell's wisdom on defining a crisis, recognizing those mental traps that can pop up, the essential role of character, and the key elements of leading effectively through tough times. And hopefully, our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of how to apply these ideas to their own lives, whether they're running a team, navigating a personal struggle, or just trying to build that inner strength for whatever life throws their way.
And if there's one takeaway I hope everyone holds on to, it's this. Crises are a part of life. They're going to happen, but they don't have to define us.
By embracing these principles we've been talking about today, we can face these challenges with courage and a commitment to our values.
And who knows, we might even come out the other side as stronger, more compassionate, more effective leaders.
That's what we're aiming for. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. If you knew a crisis was coming in a month, what's one step you would take today to prepare, based on what we've learned?
That's a great question to sit with. Because as we've seen today, the best time to prepare for a crisis is before it actually happens.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into leading through crisis, everyone. We hope you found it useful and encouraging. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and lead with courage.